it. I wanted to put this on the first slide here because this is an awesome image. I love this image. It was taken by a couple entomologists I know and love it. But we'll get into the first slide here, which talks about just that. What does this insect look like? What's it called? This is the Mediterranean oak borer, properly named as it goes after oaks, as we'll talk about in a bit. I'm going to call it MOB for the rest of the talk. Just so you know, its scientific name or genus species name is Xyleborus monographus. And it's part of this family Curculionidae, which in its subfamily Scolatini, the ambrosia beetles. You've probably heard of ambrosia beetles. Ambrosia bark beetles are on the news and the radio, the newspaper a lot these days because a lot of our invasive insects are in this group. And unfortunately, this is just another one to add to the North American invader list. It's light brown, kind of a reddish light brown over its entire body, legs, everything like that. Has these elbowed antennae, and it's really quite small. That's something that I want everyone to walk away understanding today. We're talking 3 millimeters at an adult female size, and I think the males are even a touch smaller than that at times. But we're looking at a really small beetle, so you're not usually going to see this one unless you happen to see the damage first, and then you look a little closer with maybe a lens or take it under the scope and take a closer look. And so, I highly recommend that before you sound the alarm bells that you think you've detected this beetle, it's important to take photos, take a specimen, and try to get it to someone who can give you some better insight. If you're a nerd like me and you want to understand more about its morphological kind of delineation from other similar looking beetles, because there are a lot of beetles that are this small and in this ambrosia beetle group, there's a great publication by Robaglia et al. 2020. I have a little screenshot of the first page there on the slide. Curtis Ewing is one of the co-authors there, and I talk about some of his work today. He works with CAL FIRE in California and has a real passion for this species. So I encourage you to reach out to Curtis or any of the other authors here if you want more information that I don't get to today. But yeah, take a look at that if you want more morphological characteristics. But let's talk about its biology and its ecology because that is, well, I'm interested in that. And obviously it's extremely pertinent to what we're talking about. If you want to understand how to, identify this insect or stop it from becoming a pest in Utah, understanding where it is, when it is, those are important things to get after. And so the females are usually the individuals that are moving. The males are pretty much refined to staying in the tree itself. They don't usually leave. It's the females that are actually flying from tree to tree. And so if you see one of these beetles on the outside of the tree bark, you're likely seeing a female. And they hunker down in the winter and then mate with their siblings, their brothers, and emerge in the spring. I know, weird. And then after they emerge, they fly from that current tree that they're in to a new tree and start to burrow into that tree and create a new subsequent population from there. Egg to adult maturation is about 5 to 8 weeks. And in California, they're looking at 2+ generations per year. We think we're going to be similar here in Oregon. The jury's still out on that, though. We have to do some more observation to confirm that. But we're likely in it 2 or more as well. And you can see, just for size reference, here's the end of a leaded pencil here in the bottom left, and there's an adult walking across a split piece of wood. The males actually have this fun little ornate horn on their pronotum like that, which is kind of adorable, if you ask me. And this on the top right is a picture of a tree that has infestation. And you'll notice I've got that little sunshine emoji there. If you have sun shining on one side of a tree, that's the side of the tree that's going to be most attractive to a new female arriving there and setting up shop. And so oftentimes trees that are on the edge of a forest are the ones that are going to be hit first. Those in the shade back into the depths of the forest probably not inoculated as quickly. That's after they've been there a while. And I think I've got more slides talking about this. Yeah, so important thing and a really fascinating thing about these beetles is that they actually are little farmers. The females bring with them, I believe it's either in their mandibles or in their legs, I can't remember which, but they bring spores from fungus in their previous tree where they were living. And when they dig into their new tree, the novel host tree, they actually inoculate that tree with fungal spores. There's a variety of fungal species they bring along with them, but notably Rafaela montei and Fusarium solani are two species of fungi that are brought along. Rafaeli montei is extremely concerning because that's the one that has been the biggest issue with killing trees. It's actually the fungus that they bring with them that eventually kills the tree. Obviously, them feeding on the fungus material doesn't help, but it's the fungus that spreads through the tree and causes the most damage. The fungus is there for feed for these beetles. They actually farm it. So they bring that fungi there, it grows and forms a matrix within the cambium layer. And then the beetles come along and feed on that growing fungi. Really fascinating. I threw in this picture here of another beetle species that is of similar ecology. It's not MOB because we don't have a lot of images on this beetle species yet here. But I wanted to give you the indication that in their, little tunnels within the wood that they bore into, they're farming that fungus, which you can see that kind of foam looking white material, and they're feeding on it. And so that's where you'd have female start that little tunnel, and then her subsequent progeny would feed and live there in the tunnel, which we call a gallery. And that gallery is a big part of the tree damage that is going to occur after that infestation occurs. So what happens first? Usually, in most cases that we've seen in California and Oregon so far, we're getting, and also in its native range, this kind of top-down effect where the beetle makes its way into the canopy of the tree, goes into one of the large established branches, introduces the fungus, starts feeding on the fungus there, creating galleries in the wood, and then working its way down towards the soil level. And that takes a few years for it to do that. But you'll notice this canopy dieback because as that beetle digs into that branch, it inoculates the fungi. The fungi then causes an oak wilt that works its way up the rest of that branch and kills the rest of that branch. And so you get these branches that are dead and dying back, and eventually the whole canopy will die back. And that's a major point of our search, is looking for trees that do have canopy dieback. You'll see wood boring dust at the bottom of these trees too, where they actually excavate and dig these galleries out, and they leave dust all over the bottom of the trunk bark, and it's pretty noticeable. I think I've got some pictures of that right here. You can see it looks like somebody did some woodworking projects just above that part of the tree. And the galleries themselves have a thick, dark, bluish black stain inside of them. And you can see that a little bit better here. They look kind of like a lattice structure. Once you get a lot of beetles moving around that tree and creating tunnels, the galleries overlap and create this kind of lattice structure. It's important to note that we also have other beetle species that will show up in trees, but these beetles are going after healthy trees, ones that are not as much in decline. And they go after declining trees just the same, but they go after healthy ones too. So our native species commonly go after trees that are already dead or dying. And so if you see a tree that's been down for a while and you see galleries like this, there's potential it could be something else as well. And that's where, again, sending it to someone like Kate or Mare here would be helpful for you to do. But yeah, that's kind of what eventually happens, is you get this tree that's full of these galleries. And in its native range, which I'll talk about more in a second here, which is the Mediterranean, hence the name, parts of North Africa, Middle East. It's primarily feeding on dead and dying trees, ones that have either are actively falling over or have fallen over. And so they are a natural kind of recycler of this wood waste, and they're of somewhat benefit in those areas. They can break out in pest populations at times, but their primary function there in their native European forests is to break down rotting wood material and help that carbon sequestration cycle happen. So they're usually, secondary invaders is what we call them. Primary invaders being, those that are helping go after trees as they're rotting. And so that's something to keep in mind too. So MOB acts as a primary invader. It's invading a tree as it's healthy and brings it from healthy status all the way to death. And again, native situation would be that it's a secondary invader taking it from a dead and dying tree into the ground. Host trees in California, so far they've observed it in valley oak primarily. They have observed it in blue oak and black oak as well, but it's been mostly in valley oak. And unfortunately, pretty devastating losses in 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 or 5 at the most. They're getting mortality of these trees. And it hasn't been in California very long, and already seeing quite a few die back in some of their native valley oak forests. Here in Oregon, it's going after our Oregon white oak, or Quercus garryana. We haven't observed it in other oaks that are here in Oregon yet, but I have a feeling that could change in the future. But this one species has quite a massive range, all the way from British Columbia, Canada, down into California. And it is a really important keystone species for our native habitats here. Largely because it's a food source for a lot of our birds, other insect species. It's also, providing that food source, like I said, over a large range, and it can live up to 500 years. This is a long-lived tree. This is something that is present in its ecosystem for many, many generations, and it's something that if you lose this part of your habitat, it's very hard to replace. And the other benefit of Oregon oak is that it's drought tolerant species. And as we're going through droughts in the last few years here in Oregon, we're really concerned that we're going to lose a species that is ready and able to adapt to some of these warmer conditions. And on top of that, an oak that's been in drought stress for a few years is also much more vulnerable to attack by MOB. And on top of that, too, we have an urban sprawl that's moving across the Willamette Valley, places like Portland, Salem, all the small towns in between. And as you have those urban and suburban sprawls develop, you do disturb root beds around these trees, although they're trying to be preserved by many of our cities. That kind of disturbance can also weaken the trees. And so that urban sprawl and changing climate has really stressed out the Oregon white oak. And now here comes this new beetle that's going to be stressing it out as well. And so we're very concerned as land managers of what's going to happen here. And so we're keeping a close eye on our habitats in the Willamette Valley, especially where we have Oregon white oak in between our farmland and some of our native tree stands. And not to mention habitat loss, but there's also a huge impact economically. Obviously California is going through that now. Oregon is as well. Just in the PDX area or Portland area alone, we have over 160,000 Quercus species logged in our tree inventories there. And I have a feeling we'd have a large proportion of oaks in our Eugene, Salem, Roseburg, other large municipalities that would have pretty massive inventories of these oaks that are ornamentally planted as well. So yeah, there's a huge looming threat here for Oregon. And maybe Utah as well. Obviously, it's not in Utah yet, and I'll talk a little bit about its range momentarily. But, Oregon and California are not very far from Utah, and there's a lot of transport of goods back and forth. And so I think it would be important for all of you in Utah to be thinking about what are our risks if it does end up showing up here. And I thought immediately of the native gamble oak that you have out there. I know there's some debate on where gamble oak species ends and begins. There's maybe some other subspecies out there, but it's an important, I'd say, keystone species for Utah as well. I don't know if it will be susceptible to MOB. I don't want to speculate, but I also think it should be out there and recognized as a possible threat. Curtis Ewing, like I mentioned earlier, is an entomologist in California, is working on a comprehensive host tree list right now for North America. And I am interested in connecting with him more on this topic. I want to see if he's looked at gamble oak or any of his collaborators have looked at gamble oak. I think as we build out these things, we've got to think about larger impacts. I know thinking on the more urban street tree side of this, Utah also has its own urban, street tree inventory, I imagine. And I know Michael Coons out of the extension program there has put together some materials for all of you. So I'd look at that list and consult with some literature out of its native range in Europe and see what are some of these species, like maybe red oak or others, that are susceptible in Europe that might be susceptible here too in Utah. And there are some great resources out there. And I think I talked about that up here. Yeah, I wanted to go back here, and it's native range here too, beyond oak. I think it's important to note here that there are other species outside of the Quercus genus that have been of note. They are kind of like secondary hosts, though. We haven't seen a lot of activity in them, and they include things like beech, ash, hornbeam, elm, birch, hazelnut. But again, these are more singleton observations in its European native range. I haven't seen that in North America in any of the literature that I've reviewed. And the scientists that talk about it in Europe say it's a kind of very rare instances, almost exclusively found in oak. So, getting at its distribution in a little more detail here, like I said, it's native to the Mediterranean. It goes all the way over into the Middle East, parts of North Africa, up into Germany, all the way over into Portugal. So you've got quite a Mediterranean kind of distribution there where it's been for, millions of years and established there and coexisting and co-evolve with the oak species there. And so those oaks are more resistant and just have a better defense against the species. And then, recently it shows up California and Oregon, and our native oak species are just not quite as prepared. They didn't co-evolve with this beetle. And so they are really susceptible to infestation and die quickly after infestation, especially with some of these fungi that come along with the beetle. And I have a kind of a delineation here in a moment of the timeline there. So we had a single detection in 2018, which at the time we thought was the first detection in North America. And that was near Portland, Fairview, Portland area. And we did a kind of a large trapping effort in the years after 2018 to try and understand what was going on there. We didn't really get anything in our traps until 2021. And so we had that first initial trap, went and did delimitation, looked for it everywhere around that Portland area, didn't find it. And then after continual years of trapping, we did find it again in 2021. And now we know it's pretty widely established, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But simultaneously, California had detected it, and in 2019 had it confirmed. They think they've had it since the early, 2010, 2011 timeline, but they look back in their catalogs of submitted insects, and it looks like it could have been as early as 2017 that they actually found it. 2019 was the official first detection, but they have tracked it to be earlier than that. And now they have it in several counties in California, and it's spread pretty widely. So our initial response in Oregon looks a little like this around that ground zero. This is, again, this Fairview, Troutdale, East Portland area. You can see the star here is where we had that initial detection in 2018, right on the Columbia River there. Notably, a lot of commerce goes on in our ports, our airports, and a large freeway being right there too. So it's possible it came in on something. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But that star indicates where we first trapped it. And again, that was a single adult. And then in 2019, the next year, we set out traps in all these red dot areas to try and understand, are there more? Is this an established population we sensed? Or is this a singleton that just hop off a truck and we happen to find it? And in 2019, we didn't find any in the surrounding area. We continued to trap, though, and as the years went on, the story did change, and we found that it was much more widespread than we thought. And this is a hard map to see because we're looking at a pretty large area. But the important thing to note here is that this is spanning 2018 to 2023. And the red large dots are the most recent trap information from this last year. And you can see we now have it in that original area up there just east of Portland in the Fairview area along the Columbia River. which is these two red dots. And it's spread into a certain, it's this, I think a terminal, a Port of Portland terminal, just north of downtown. This is Tualatin, near where I'm speaking today, just south of Portland area. And then as you follow the I-5 corridor, this orange line, you see it show up in places like Wilsonville, just south of Wilsonville into Woodburn, and then all the way down into Salem. We have trap capture data in the last 3 years since 2021. And so, although we had a little latent period between 2018 and 2020, 2021 onward, we've gotten pretty consistent trap data coming in. And so I think all of us are sitting there thinking, how in the world did this happen? This seems like it was there for a while. How did it move in? You know, how did we not sense this? And it is frustrating, but likely it came in from some kind of untreated wood product, firewood, or a nursery product. We have amazing, federal support from APHIS to go through and do all of these inspections on our goods as they come through, but they can't get to everything. And so there are goods that do slip through the cracks. And so it's our suspicion that it's either a pallet or some other wood product that likely moved into the Portland area, and the beetle emerged from that wood and then spread into the surrounding area. It's hard to say, though. It could be a number of different things. But firewood, pallets, even barrels have been suspected. We've had other people working with us that have said, wine barrels from the Mediterranean area could be a vector of pathway here. So we're looking at potentially trapping in areas where, vineyards might have wine barrels brought in. But there's, so many things to look at here. It's hard to really blame any one of these, but it's important to understand that I think firewood and pallets and other wood products are going to be one of your main vector points. And you should have if you're in the regulatory side of this story, that's where you should be focusing a big part of your energy. And so right now, I apologize, I didn't realize there's animations there. The story goes that we're trying to respond to this. We know we have it. We know it's kind of exploded here in the northwest side of Oregon. And so now what? What do we do in 2024 going forward? We really want to focus our efforts, and we have been the last 12 months, on outreach and sharing information with the public. And a lot of that's focused on slowing the spread of wood. Oak is an ideal wood burning, material. And so people love moving their oak trees that have fallen and sharing them with neighbors and people on the other side of the state. We're really concerned by that. And so we're putting a lot of our efforts into slow the spread, and also public reporting, which I'll talk about in just a moment. We're also going into visual surveys, looking at as many oak trees as possible. And I'll talk about that more in a bit. We're looking at setting traps. And so we want to use these traps to understand, how far is it spreading from where it already is? And are there other novel locations in Oregon that we're not looking yet that might have it as well? And then obviously long-term management, and how do we, properly destroy trees that we know are infested with this material? Do we need to initiate quarantines? That's, something we haven't done yet because we don't understand the scope of the problem, but it's something to consider. And then obviously pushing for a lot of research. We want to look into what biological control options there are. So we'll be working with Oregon State University, Oregon Department of Forestry, U.S. Forest Service, and others on what options we have. And I'll talk about a few ideas. One that we proposed is going to Europe, and with a number of entomologists looking at what natural enemies are in Europe that we might bring to the Western states and for release. Obviously, that's years down the line from now, but we want to get the conversation started about how to help Mother Nature slow this thing down. But to go back to that first bullet point of, our first initial response is going to be outreach and public information. Again, it's focused on avoiding the movement of infested materials or potentially infested materials. So this buy it where you burn it logo, the Don't Move Firewood initiative, the Nature Conservancy has been pushing that for many years, and it's a wonderful program. They have great resources. I imagine they're probably connected with the campgrounds and other state and federal programs in Utah. They're integrally involved with us here in Oregon, and we try to partner with them on creating signage and brochures and things that interact with the public and online. We're also, pushing a lot of information about what to do with infested material if you're in a location where we've, identified MOB, or, they know by our visual surveys information that I'll share with you in a bit that they're in an infested area, teaching them how to basically process this wood material. Right now, we focused on burning the wood, tarping it, or chipping it to 1 inch by 1 inch. All these burning obviously is a guaranteed success. Tarping and chipping, along with burial, are kind of undocumented in their success. We have some anecdotal evidence from California, but tarping, it sounds like you've really got to dry it out. And if you have any moisture in that tarped material, they can survive. If you tarp the material and dry it out with some venting, we've been told that that can kill off the beetle inside the tarp. In Utah, you should have no problem getting them dry enough. In Oregon, that's a little more of a challenge, at least for the western part of the state. Chipping, we're going to be doing some work with CAL FIRE this next summer on understanding how effective the chipping is at killing the adults in the infested wood. We know that, without a doubt, it's killing a good number of adults in that process, but we just don't know how effective it is yet. And burial of material underground is also a big unknown. People have tried that here in Oregon already. It's experimental at this point. We don't know how deep. I've had recommendations of 8 inches or more underground from a lot of entomologists, but again, this is a new insect. It's a new problem for North America, and we don't have a lot of best management practices yet. And then the other thing that we're focused on with outreach is having people from the public report potential sightings. And if that's a tree that looks like it's got massive canopy dieback, they can report that. They can report images or specimen of beetles as well. And the main forum in which they're able to do that is through the Oregon Invasive Species Council's hotline, which I have a logo up in the top right here. And people from the public can actually report these images, and our trained entomologists then go in and look at those images and then make an assessment of, is this legit? Do we need to go take another look? And that has actually been really helpful to us here in the beginning. We've had a lot of great submissions, and that was a part of the reason we were able to find out that Wilsonville, which I'll talk about in a minute, just south of Portland, had a really large infestation, a really large problem. And so we had a lot of people submitting through that portal. And you can actually go and check that out as well if you go to the Oregon Invasive Species online hotline. So check that out. But I, recommend that if Utah hasn't done anything like that already, practice and get ready with some of your current pests and interact with your extension in that way. It's wonderful. The other thing, obviously, is fact sheets, and we've got a whole lot of them. And all these cooperators that I've listed on this screen, we've got, Department of Forestry, Forest Service at the federal level. Several of our soil and water conservation districts have been very helpful with local information sharing. The city of Wilsonville, who has the largest infestation in Oregon right now, has been an integral part of sharing outreach materials and best management practices that we know now. And I definitely would encourage, if you need a model organism for understanding how a city can respond, go check out the city of Wilsonville's website and their page on MOB. It's fantastic. But there's been a lot of collaboration that's helped tremendously. And I think Utah has similar methods of sharing information, and I imagine that they would employ those as well. The other part of our response the next year and going forward is visual survey. We initiated some visual surveys in 2023, and then we continue to do them here in the winter even. And it's a team of entomologists here at the ODA, as well as ODF, and some of our federal and local agencies that are partnered with us. And we're utilizing Survey 123. It's an ArcGIS application that's extremely versatile and dynamic and able to be accessed online by many people. It's a much easier portal to interact with survey. And we have a live dashboard that shows people our progress of where we've seen Mediterranean oak borer. And I have a link to that here if you want to check that out later. And this is what it should look like. I don't know that it's going to show up. Oh, shoot. Well, I can show you that. I'm trying to think. I might come back to that at the end. I'll show you what the dashboard looks like. We can interact with it if we have time. But it's been very helpful because it gives you the number of trees that are currently being observed that have MOB in them, some that might be a maybe, trees that are in decline, but we're not sure why yet. And that, again, would be an indication that we need to go do a second look. It's been a wonderful platform, and I highly recommend you start using that if you haven't already. It's wonderful. This is what it looks like when you take the Survey 123 app and use it. It asks you who you're affiliated with, your name, the date, and then you can select the location of the tree that you're looking at on the map. And you indicate, is this an oak tree? And all the other information that comes along with that. It steps you through line by line, what are you seeing? Can you share images with us? And it talks about, what level of dieback do you see in the canopy? And that can be important too. And they can also collect a sample, and we have our address there for them to send us samples as well. Oh, here's my dashboard. That's where it went. It must have skipped. Apologies for that. But you can see here, the dashboard shows people where we've been collecting visual sample and information. The diamond green, dark green says, yes, we have detected it in this location. The circle is a possible or maybe, and then the square showing those locations where we have not found it in the tree that was observed visually. We've only done 66 trees. This is brand new. We hope to do a lot more this next summer as there's more leaf out and we can see canopy dieback a little easier. It's a little bit tricky in the winter to see dieback. Beyond visual survey, an important aspect to all this, like I mentioned earlier, is trapping. And we will continue to do trapping into the future. And that's something that Utah could start doing now as kind of a passive way to collect information, is put up some of these traps. Entomologists in California have recommended the panel, dual panel trap that's on the right of the picture there. You can see that the beetle interacts with the trap by hitting the panel, and then it would drop down into the actual collection jar at the bottom, the white jar, which has, a mixture of antifreeze and other material. And then that will be collected and inspected by a trained entomologist who can see if it's the species of concern. The other one is the funnel trap that you see here on the left. We're going to be using the funnel trap because we have a lot of them already for other beetle species that we're looking for. Both of these utilize ethanol lures. Ethanol mimics some of the plant volatiles that are emitted from a stressed tree. So an oak tree that maybe has had root damage from landscaping or drought stress or whatever the case is going to be emitting volatiles and secondary plant compounds, phenolics, things like that, alkaloids that are attractive to these beetles. And ethanol is kind of like a supernormal stimuli of those stress factors. And so an ethanol lure makes the beetle think that this black looking outline is a tree trunk, and it flies towards it, hits it, and drops into the collection jar. And these are very helpful for covering large areas for monitoring, and we'll be using that across the state. In this grid, you can see where we're going to be placing detection traps. This is the west side of Oregon, where we have the largest presence of entomologists and people able to get coverage, as well as where a majority of our oak forests and urban sprawls with ornamental oaks planted are available. And so we have about 45 detection traps that are going to be put out in these areas. And then we'll be doing a delimitation, which is a high density trapping around our known areas of infestation. So as you can see here, this is a small map. It's hard to see. I apologize for that. But in the northeast corner there, or the top right, you can see where we originally had our detection up there on the Columbia River, just east of Portland. And we're continuing to trap around that location, as well as the other location near the Port of Portland. And then we have another cluster of delimitation traps here near Wilsonville and Tualatin, and then several in Salem to the south here. And we're hoping that this helps us understand where it potentially is spreading from its current established range. And then, like I said before, these detection traps will help us understand, are there established populations in Southern Oregon or other parts of the Cascade Range or west of there that we don't currently understand? And so hopefully after 2024 trapping, we have a better idea. We're going to do 2 or 3 years of this. And so check back in with me soon. I'll have updates for you on that. But Wilsonville is a great example of how the state has responded and how local city government has also responded. Wilsonville is just south of Portland, and they've suffered some of the worst infestation. They have a large number of their street trees and some of their park trees that they care about tremendously that are infested. And they're noticing this canopy dieback. And so we've been working with them on kind of creating this initial response. They've helped us build up protocols. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we've done with them. Burning was our first recommendation. They had a lot of trees that were needing to be taken down so that the beetle was taken care of and there wasn't further spread. So they went ahead and took down many of their dead and dying trees and took them to a drop zone within the city. And we supplied them with an air curtain incinerator, or burn boss, which we then used to burn up the material. This is a really helpful tool. If you work with any green waste disposal companies in Utah and you haven't been familiar with an air curtain incinerator, I encourage you to go research it, look into it. It's a really helpful tool, not only for Mediterranean oak borer, but for emerald ash borer, for a variety of other wood borers that you want to destroy wood quickly and effectively with. We did notice that it was tough to burn some of these larger, very mature white oaks because they are massive. And so it was a lot longer than, say, a small ash tree that's, DBH of 10, 15 inches. Those burn really quickly. Some of these larger oaks took a while to burn. But it is a guaranteed way to know that you're not spreading the insect, and you also get a decent byproduct of ash that can be used for a number of other agricultural reasons. They're also burying some of their infested trees. Again, we don't know how effective this will be, but they're doing it more than 8 inches, which is similar species kind of criteria for burial. And they're also starting to do treatments. And this is specifically an area where I really want to throw a line of caution out here. We don't currently recommend officially any type of insecticide or fungicide, but there have been some reports from California that some of these landscapers, arborists, people who are dealing with the problem in their valley oak down there, and they're trying to slow this thing down, they are trying to use some trunk injection insecticides as well as trunk injection fungicides to slow it down. They've seen really mixed results, and honestly, the results haven't been very great. Not a huge amount of efficacy yet, but they have seen at least some use and efficacy in things like imamectin benzoate, which is an arborjet product, and propiconazole. I can't pronounce that, I apologize, but that's the fungicide. It's important to note that because you're dealing with a fungus and an insect in this case, you would need a combination treatment. It would have to go together to be effective. Again, there's no research backing up the use of these products yet, and I strongly recommend you talk to somebody that's a licensed applicator about this and what your options might be in your area and your situation. And again, I hope that Oregon and California continue to do more work. I know we'd like to show some of the results that Wilsonville's had. Wilsonville went ahead and used this. That was the judgment call of the city officials. And so we'll be able to see how effective that was here in the coming years. It's a treatment that can last 2 to 3 years per injection. And so if it does work, I think it could be of real help to especially their parks and important trees in their public areas. But this isn't a viable option for your native stands of oak. It just would be really, really expensive. And obviously you'd have to treat indefinitely at that point. So trying to stop the spread is the first place to put your energy. With that, I want to end with any questions you might have. I also have some references here if people want to learn more about what I talked about. This is where I got my information. But yeah, open to any questions you might have.
All right. First up, I answered some of these best I could, but they asked if there was any chance of getting MOB in from greenhouse grown trees that were grown in Oregon.
That's a good question. Usually when we're dealing with those greenhouse trees, they're under, conditions that are not ideal for this pest. So you're looking at trees that are pretty small DBH. But to say there's zero risk would be a mistake. There is some. And I know that Utah currently doesn't take any of our ash, but I don't know how much oak is on their radar yet. So it's kind of an unknown as far as how much pressure is being put on that industry. And again, we don't have quarantine set up because we don't know how far reaching this problem is. But yeah, if I was someone that was importing oak ornamental trees from Oregon, I think I'd want to be talking to the distributor. Where are they? Can they show there's an example of trapping near them? And is there negative data in that trapping? Those are all the right questions to be asking. And that will be kind of subjective to where you're looking at in Oregon. If you're somebody who's buying from Wilsonville and taking in larger plantings of oak, that would be of particular interest and risk.
Cool. And before I forget, we did put the link to the CEU credits in the chat, just so everyone knows, and for the evaluation as well. Another question was about if heavy pruning of the affected tree will stop the spread of the insect, and will it stop the fungus throughout the lower part of the tree?
You know, it certainly won't make the situation worse if you prune. If you notice, I had some photos back here. Let me see if I can progress to earlier slides. One of my observed trees, here's one right here. This is a location in Wilsonville where we had a beautiful white oak that was on a landscaper company's property, actually, and it was really well maintained. And you can see here in the picture, they actually did go ahead and prune back some of these branches that were dead. My suspicion is that they would have made this pruning before they knew it was Mediterranean oak borer. And so it would have been pruning that happened, you know, maybe more for aesthetic reasons than for stopping the beetle itself. But I will say that whatever the case, this tree was eventually taken out. It did die completely. And so the pruning was not successful. But again, I don't know if that's because they didn't cut far enough back, because they didn't know there was beetle present. But the truth of it is that when you see, you know, even I'd say more than like 10 to 20% canopy dieback, that ship has sailed. You know, I've had entomologists in California tell me that 30% dieback might as well like not even treat at that point. It's probably a tree that's pretty well gone at that point. That being said, we don't have a lot of research to back up those claims. And so I would say if you can afford to make the treatment and it's, you know, done properly and it's a tree that's worth investing in, it's a worthy, a little bit of an experiment to take on your own, I think.
I answered this one from my knowledge that there have been multiple introductions of MOB, but they were asking about genetic testing to see if the Oregon and California populations are different.
Yeah, from what we know right now from genetic testing, again, this is from our, I think 2018 and 2021 specimen that were submitted. They were from Germany. So we have a more Northern European population here in Portland area. And I believe California is from another part of the Mediterranean. I want to say either France or Italy, but I can't remember which of the two it was. But I do know that it was distinctive. They were two different introductions, which I think goes back to that pathway slide talking about, you know, how are these things moving around? We definitely need to have conversations with APHIS about how we can control for these a little better. We've had arguments within our own camp about is the heat treatment sufficient at this time. A lot of people recommend the 60 minutes at 60 degrees C, or I think that's 170 Fahrenheit or something like that. Is that hot enough or long enough? And there's a lot of literature that's starting to pop up in the bark beetle world that's saying maybe it's not, and maybe we need to up that or make the duration longer. So a lot to consider there, but yeah, it looks like two different introductions.
Okay. While you're on the slide of the public dashboard, are there any plans for that to come to Utah? Is that a Oregon specific thing?
That's a good question. Technically, if you're a trained entomologist, you can reach out to us and contribute to this. That being said, you know, I think it would be prudent for, you know, I know in your camp, it's probably Chris Watson and Joey Caputo. for them to make their own dashboard so that you don't have a bunch of data bleeding together. But I would encourage Chris or Joe, if they're here, or others that are involved at that level, I'd love to work with you and help share how we built this survey and share the methods. No problem.
And can you go quickly back to the slide, or can you talk about the app that they could download that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's just through Survey 123. It's an ArcGIS based application. But if you type in Survey 123 into Google, you'll be able to come up with that. And it's extremely helpful. We've been using it for Emerald Ash Borer as well. And it's just an easy way to have a lot of people contribute geographical information and have it be in a live setting where you can see the results in real time. It's great. You know, if you have somebody that can help moderate that, it's a very helpful tool.
The next question is, and we'll see if I can say it, has propiconazole, wow, been shown effective against oak wilt?
You know, it has in other instances. We're talking about several different types of fungal species in this situation. That Raffaele Montei being one of the worst that causes some of the worst oak wilt along with this beetle. And I do know that, again, in other species situations, this product is used for oak wilt. But I just don't have it specifically, tied to this insect species. But yeah, it has proven effective with other oak wilts.
Well, thank you. We got a couple more questions. What is the economic importance of MOB?
Yeah, I think, for people that are, maybe not as connected to the intrinsic value of the forest, there's the immediate effect of that loss of canopy cover in your streets and in your parks. And that has pretty big financial ramifications also for adjacent homeowners who have right of way with trees in that right of way or in their street tree, little median curb there. Some of these trees are really massive, and so you're talking thousands of dollars to process just one tree that's dead and dying. You can leave the tree, but then you risk a tree fall on your house, or you deal with it now preventatively, and you have some pretty high costs from an arborist to treat, to take it down. No matter what you do, it's going to be expensive. Oak trees are usually quite large and established, so it's not an easy task. I'd say that's the biggest thing. I mean, it's hard to put a value on its natural kind of, value to the landscape though, because, our riparian corridors obviously are a very important part of Oregon. And if you lose the oaks that are kind of protecting those riparian corridors, you get more sun exposure. You get a totally different landscape that's coming into play at that point. You lose your acorn resources. And so you're changing the ecosystem. And so, I mean, we could have a discussion for a long time about what those financial losses are, but I think they're more priceless in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I know you guys have put out some resources, but I don't remember off the top of my head, is there a list of trees that are less susceptible
That's
to
a
your
good
knowledge
question.
right now?
Yeah, we don't necessarily have that. A lot of people have asked me, well, should I not plant Oregon white oak and should I, plant something else? My thing is that it's all about diversity. If you're a landscaper, and you've been a part of this like monoculture culture where you're going to go buy a lot of one type of plant and plant just that species because it's the right price. I know that money speaks, but at the end of the day, I think your investment will go a lot longer if you have a diversity of species. And so my biggest recommendation is to go as diverse as possible. I know that's easier said than done, but that's right now what we're recommending people. But yeah, I don't necessarily have a list of replacement species at this point. We could talk maybe more about like native species replacements if you're doing conservation work. In Oregon, I have a number of species I could recommend you. But I think in Utah, you'd have to do your own assessment and talk about, what are trees that are filling that niche that we would consider as viable replacements. I did leave a brief reference there to the work by Michael Coons from the OSU Extension. And I encourage you to go check that out. There's actually a page that says, what oaks to plant in Utah, and he lists those out. And I would go then and cross-reference that with that Robeglia et al. Paper, which I think I have right here referenced. This research paper goes pretty exhaustively into what oak species have been observed with MOB in them in Europe. And so if I were you, I'd go look at that work by Michael Coons and see what he's recommending for Utah, and then see which of those are susceptible to MOB in its native range, and try to avoid those ones and plant just those that are maybe not on that list that is on the Robeglia et al. Paper.
Great, thank you. Let's see. We had a question asking, would you say these beetles impact sea level higher humidity area versus high elevation mountain regions and low humidity areas?
It's a good question. I would say I'm not sure about humidity, but a lot of it is definitely temperature based, and humidity is obviously related to that. Right now, a lot of the work being done in California by Curtis Ewing and other entomologists, they're actually putting data loggers for temperature on the sun exposed side of the tree and the northern kind of shaded part of the tree, and seeing if there's even a difference on a individual tree level of activity of the beetles. And so I think, again, going back to these beetles are extremely temperature influenced. In fact, if you get a warm enough day in California, Curtis was saying that you actually see emergence in the dead of winter in places like January or February, which in a lot of other insects, that's pretty unheard of. Once they go into diapause, they usually hold that winter diapause through the winter and then emerge in the spring when you get consistently higher, cumulative degree days. But these insects have shown to be active at acute times when there's enough sun during that individual day to move. And so I think temperature is your biggest thing there. I'm trying to remember what that threshold was, but I would guess, any day you're pushing over 60 to 70 degrees for a number of hours, that's going to be enough for this species. I'm sure that there's probably a publication out there talking about some of those developmental thresholds with temperature. But yeah, I can't speak to humidity quite as directly.
Okay, looks like we've got two more. Is there a study of hybridizing European and US oak for resistance purposes?
Ah, that is really interesting. I would say there may be something out there and somebody's, tinkering in a lab somewhere, but it's not been published yet and not been talked about yet. If we think about, chestnut blight or things like that have been a long-standing issue out in the East, it took them many, many years to get to the point where they were hybridizing those, what is it, the Chinese chestnut with the American native variety, and it took them many, many trials to get that right. And so given the fact that this beetle showed up in 2018 here in Oregon and 2017 in California, we're really in our infancy as far as what we have available to us. And I haven't seen in the literature yet anything of that nature, but it's always, potential for someone to be working on it actively.
Yeah, do you think that those times when you detected it is when it arrived, or do you think it was already present kind of at low levels and then maybe the drought stress and climate changes affected it? I'm just curious, that one's for me.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think that, we're not far off. I would guess we're in the ballpark of 5 years before potentially, because the level of infestation we're seeing in Wilsonville, we have trees that are completely dead, or have infestation all the way down to the soil level, like beetles exiting the trunk. So that means they've worked their way all the way down the canopy, all the way down the trunk, and now they're exiting and making galleries in the bottom of the trunk. And so that's, indicating to us that it's been at least 2 to 5 years that it's been around. And so it was probably earlier than 2018. How much earlier, it's hard to say. We have been trapping with ethanol baited lured traps for many years. And so we're not seeing other locations outside of these areas that I just showed you yet. But we are at low trapping densities. And so now that we're going to increase our trap density, there's a possibility that we're going to say, uh-oh, it was in other areas too. But that remains to be seen.
Yeah, while you're talking about the ethanol and those hormones, someone had asked, do we know what attracts the beetles to these oak species, is it a specific hormone or chemical? I know you mentioned the ethanol is used in the traps.
Yeah, so ethanol is really mimicking those, I think it's phenols, and there's other things like alkaloids, things that trees emit all the time. And that's kind of how they communicate to the world, hey, I'm stressed, or, whatever their status is. And so that ethanol is kind of like a supernormal stimuli to these beetles. They're already kind of honed in to some of these plant volatiles, and the ethanol is like an extreme version of those. And so that's what's attracting them. They're saying to themselves, wow, this is a stress tree. That's going to be easy pickings for me. That's an ideal tree. And so, you could have, and we've seen this here in Wilsonville, one tree perfectly healthy, right next to it, a tree that's just been absolutely hammered. And it's because that tree next to it maybe had a house built right next to it, and the roots were disturbed, and kind of brought its immune response down. It's emitting more stress volatiles, and mimicking what you would have in like a trap where that ethanol is really strong, bringing them in.
All right, looks like we've got one last one to wrap it up.
These are
This
great
person,
questions, by the way. I appreciate it.
this person was asking again about kind of the pruning aspect, and if you did prune a tree, would the galleries be easily seen? When you remove that damage, would you be able to tell kind of what symptoms would you look for there?
Yeah, excellent question. And I highly recommend doing that. If you see a tree with that flagging, or what we refer to as that dieback, or wilt, I would definitely get a pole saw or some trained arborist up in the tree to take a sample, because if you do create a cross section at or just below where it's dying, you should see some galleries in there with that dark blue black stain in it. And that would be a great indicator. And there are plenty of pictures online in our fact sheets for examples of what you're looking for there. But yeah, and I'd also be really careful too, if you do ever get into the situation where you find it in Utah. We've stressed with our arborist here, you need to clean your material. And I think that isopropyl alcohol and a number of other things you can use, like, probably spray cleaners, but you want to spray and clean your chainsaw bar, your pruning devices, whatever you're using to cut, and make sure you're not going from tree to tree inoculating it with that fungus. That's important to remember too.